G'day, mate. Luke Ford here, reflecting on the life and times of my father. So I was just talking to someone and pointed out, hey, your dad died at 90, and he was just rigorously on this very strict health regime. His brother died at 87. His brother was an alcoholic, overweight, didn't care about his health hardly at all. So why so little difference? So yeah, I think probably genetics is the primary thing that counts for length of life. Also, my father raised us all on essentially an 80-10-10 diet, meaning 80% carbs, 10% protein, 10% fat. And I don't think it was particularly a healthy diet. I think something along the lines of the zone diet is probably healthier. My father, last 30 years of his life, had to manage type 2 diabetes. And I think that high carbohydrate diet that he was on didn't help. On the other hand, my father got to accomplish pretty much everything that he wanted to accomplish. He physically had the capability of getting an enormous amount of work done. So I think if you're as careful with your health as my father was, then that probably leads to higher levels of productivity. You're able to accomplish more of what you want to accomplish. You're able to live at a higher level. My father's uncle didn't really accomplish anything, didn't have any kids, didn't build anything, didn't really produce anything. I think he retired by age 50 from his work as a wharfie. And my father was working up until the final months of his life. So I think perhaps that's one place where paying attention to your health can really make a difference. Maybe not so much in the length of your life, but in the quality. Okay, up to chapter 6 of this terrific book by Milton Hook, Desmond Ford, reformist theologian, gospel revivalist. I read this and I think, wow, this is much better than anything I could have written, either about my dad or anything else. This is a well-written book. I remember how much joy it brought me the first time I got my hands on this book. I went through it in one evening. I was visiting at Loma Linda University around 2008. And I stayed with a member of the faculty there, and he gave me his copy of this book. And it just made me feel really happy to read a book essentially by someone very friendly to my father. So it's very different than an academic biography. This is a biography of someone who loves my dad. So everyone should be so lucky that they have a biography written about them by someone who's a friend, not just a critic. So we are at 1970 now, my father's story. So by this point, my father is 41 years of age. How does a family regain normalcy after witnessing the slow death of a loving wife and mother? That's my mother, Gwen, who died shortly after her 40th birthday. There is rarely a full recovery. Many children, despite courageous veneers, retain fragile interiors that weep or simmer angrily. Des's children struggled for years to come to terms with their family's tragedy. Suffering, says Des, makes you bitter or better. My dad was quite the master of aphorisms. He himself was buoyed by Gwen's faith and his belief in the resurrection. He maintains too that in all times of anguish, found strength by reading stories about Christian martyrs and missionaries who braved dreadful episodes. Remember my father once talking to me about Fox's Book of Martyrs, about the hundreds of thousands of Protestants who were killed at the hands of Catholics. And my father told me that it makes the Holocaust look like child's play. In a positive philosophical frame of mind just before Gwen's death, he mused, there are arbors for pilgrims on the way to Zion, and they are put there by the prince of the city, not by the devil. It is remarkable that so few have ever thought about discussing the problem of good, yet so many discuss the problem of pain and evil. Life, for most of us, has a great deal of the former, and the latter stands out because it is exceptional rather than the rule. Early in Gwen's illness, Des had experienced one touching bit of cheer. his long estranged brother Val came to their home seeking reconciliation after numerous letters Des had sent to him. When he found that Des had taken Gwen to a Sydney hospital for treatment, he was genuinely upset by the news of Gwen's illness. So my father and his brother essentially were not speaking for about 20 years because my brother was so upset about my father becoming a Seventh-day Adventist. But they reconciled upon news of my mother's illness. All right, so I want to play a little bit from Jerry Wise. He's talking about it's never too late to have a happy family. So I really like this video. It's never too late to have a happy relationship with your father.
The goal is to provide a healthy, accepting, loving environment for your inner child. This is the childhood you never had, but can have now. Yes, your parents may be gone, but you are the parents to your inner child now. They are. Even if they're not gone, they're not your parents anymore. You are. You are to be the parent to yourself. Let your inner child have a happy childhood. Recently, I had a client in a foreign country that I was working with who was very hypercritical of himself and would shame himself, degrade himself, be intolerant of himself, very mean mentally to himself. And all of these things are things he experienced growing up as a child. He just took over his parents' role while being an adult and just took over that role and did that to himself now. They don't have to be.
Okay, that's Jerry Wise, a therapist. You can find him at the Family Tree Counseling website, the Family Tree Counseling YouTube channel. Uncertain of which hospital, Val set out desperately to ask at the most likely places. Emerging from the underground town hall railway station in the vast metropolis, he fortuitously spotted Des. He tapped him on the shoulder and said, "You're Des, aren't you?" Des was overwhelmed. Their astonishing rendezvous marked the renewal of an enduring brotherly bond. I've written more letters to him than any other person on earth, Des says. And so they were close up until my uncle's death about 10 years ago. After Gwen's death, Des felt like he would like a break from the relentless duties both on and off campus. He revived prospects of doing a second doctorate, something that Gwen had wanted him to do. Church leaders were also convinced there were distinct advantages for their college accreditation purposes if lecturers, especially heads of departments, owned a doctorate from a university conducted on the British system of education. Some Australian accreditation officials were prejudiced against the American education system. In 1966, Des had corresponded with Frederick Bruce, a respected lecturer at Manchester University in England. He sent Bruce a copy of his major thesis completed at Michigan State University, received a very favorable reply. Now seemed the opportune time to realize those earlier plans. He applied for study leave, and in September of 1970, the Avondale College Board voted to sponsor him to begin a PhD at Manchester in January of 1971. These plans were endorsed at Australian Church headquarters at the same time as Lawrence Naden, president, being released by Robert Frame. Frame said to Des, "What are your plans for remarriage?" My father was in no rush to wed again. He thought he might wait until after study in England, but even then there was no urgency. His reluctance arose from the fear of having another ill partner, repetition of the trauma with Gwen. However, both Frame and David Sibley urged him to reconsider. Remember, David Sibley is a character in the terrific movie The Nostradamus Kid, about growing up a Seventh-day Adventist in Australia. So Frame and Sibley warned my father that while he remained single, he would be pursued by nuisance women. This was good advice because their concerns were well-founded. On one occasion, Des answered a knock at his front door, and he was met by a woman who said she had had a vision. "God has told me I should marry you," she gushed. Des maintained his poise and politely told her, "That is the case. I would have been given a similar vision, but I haven't." I've never had any women show up knocking at my door saying that God had told them they should marry me. Elaine harbored a different fantasy. She wished for her favorite school teacher to become her new mother. Same time, she sensed her father's only preference was Gillian Wastel, better known as Jill, a prospect Elaine resisted at first. In her diary, she wrote about her misgivings and then hid them in a broken portion of her bedroom wall. Des happened on the diary one day and learned the truth about her thoughts about Jill. He and Elaine then went for a long walk hand in hand as he tried to mollify her tears and reservations. She finally accepted her father's choice. Jill had been born in England, this is my stepmother, but migrated to New Zealand with her parents when she was 16. It was there she became a Seventh-day Adventist. So both my mother, my father, and my stepmother all became Seventh-day Adventists around the age of 16. And then went to Australia at age 21 to attend Avondale College as a new adherent. During her 5 years on campus, she helped to pay her school fees by working in the cafeteria and as a dean and assistant preceptress. It's not a word you hear very often in America. For 1 year, she did secretarial work for Des. During Gwen's illness, Jill spent many hours painting a picture for her birthday. So my stepmom is quite a painter. Very intelligent, very talented woman, my stepmother. She thought highly of Gwen and the respect was reciprocal, but Jill's name was not one Gwen considered as a future partner for Des. Jill proved to be a bright student, beginning with the Bible instructor's course, but changed over to the bachelor's degree in education. One of her early classes was the study of Daniel and Revelation with Des as lecturer. She found it a daunting task to write a 40-page essay at the end, but she had brought to college a Reader's Digest book on the Bible that contained a history of Antiochus Epiphanes. She used it together with other sources to write her essay on Daniel 11 and Revelation 13, proposing a recurring fulfillment she had heard about in class. Des gave her a straight A for it. That's the way to a man's heart. Write him a 40-page essay on Daniel 11 and Revelation 13 and propose a recurring fulfillment. That gets the blokes every time. Soon after, Des confessed to her, if I had written and published that essay, I would have been put out of my job. Robert Parr, big friend of the family. I'd always hear about Bob Parr all the time growing up. My father loved that man. Des's editor and longtime friend was told in confidence of wedding plans for the two. With his usual panache, he wrote to Des, I have met your Gillian, of course. I well understand your feelings for the lass. She is a cut above the ordinary. Touch of class she has, old boy. I first detected it in her when I received her first submission for the Signs of the Times. My stepmother's an excellent writer. She's very funny. I took the unusual step of accepting the first article she submitted and the second also. I don't know that I have ever done that before to a hitherto unpublished writer. One thing I beg of you, please do not court this lady by correspondence. Never write her a letter, in your own hand, that is. She will go absolutely bonkers trying to decipher it. And when next you see her, she will be a gibbering frustrate, a wild-eyed paranoiac who went off a rocker trying to make sense out of that spidery scrawl that you euphemistically refer to in your lighter moments as writing. If there must be correspondence, please use a typewriter. Des and Jill were married in the home of Kurumbong friends at 7 a.m. College graduation day, November 22, 1970. David Sibley conducted the service. Later that day, Jill received her degree, a Bachelor's of Education with French and German units included. So my stepmother's skills with French and German were a great assistance to my father completing his second PhD. While the newlyweds were enjoying a brief honeymoon, Elaine recalls, Paul and I, with the help of our much-beloved teacher, packed up the house, putting some things into storage and some into suitcases and boxes for Manchester. So I would have been about 4.5 years of age now. 4-year-old Luke was returned from New Zealand after a year's absence, and that same night, the Ford family of 5 boarded the boat for England. Busy day. What a daunting task it was for a young woman to start married life with 3 children already in the household. Jill had given some prayerful thought to her marriage, especially the reality of suddenly having to care for 3 children, but she proved to be equal to the task. Baby Luke responded to Mummy Jill, as he called her, and a good relationship was forged. Paul, being sensitive and quiet as a child, did not reveal his emotions so overtly, seemed to accept Jill into his boyish world. Alain spent only brief periods in the home after the marriage. Des sacrificed a large chunk of his meager income, sent her to boarding school in England. She only came home during holidays. Then she returned to Australia ahead of Des to attend Avondale College, sometimes staying with friends, but later for about 18 months with Des and Jill when they returned from England. Alain finally boarded as a college student and then returned to England for law studies. During their stay at Manchester, Des and Jill found an old stone house to rent. In the winter, it was bitterly cold. Boy, do I remember that. So damp in some rooms that the wallpaper fell off. It was so cold that I took up the task of cleaning the dishes because I got to soak my hands and my arms in hot water and warm up. But the spring and summer months were delightful with bold little birds flitting in and out of their open windows. Dad's was a big believer in the benefits of fresh air. Earlier, Frederick Bruce had told Des that the university required a minimum 2 years residence for him to earn the doctorate. When Des first met with Bruce at the university, shared some of the pressures and trauma he had endured in recent years and confessed, "I've come for a rest." Bruce responded compassionately and assured Des he would receive every assistance available to guarantee an untroubled stay on campus. "What do I do first?" he asked Bruce. "Learn German," was Bruce's blunt advice. "Then you'll need to give me a statement of where you're going to aim at in your research and what you're going to do." The English system differed from the American method of earning a doctorate. American universities required classwork culminating in comprehensive examinations with a major research project and an oral defense of the project. But English universities accomplished all the classwork at the graduate level, leaving the doctoral level entirely for a major research project with an oral defense. So Des sat in none of Bruce's classes and concentrated entirely on his own research. Yes, I remember my mother, Gwen, just a handful of memories. I think I last saw her when I was about 3 years of age. I did not see her during her last year of life. Bruce had identified the lack of German language studies as the single weak spot in Des's preparation so far in his career. So Des began a crash course of study of German, assisted by Jill. Her earlier study of German at Avondale proved to be gold bullion. German classes had been offered at Avondale for 2 years only. She happened to be there during that period. So as Des delved into German sources for his research, he understood enough to identify the pertinent passages, and Jill would translate those many pages by hand. Her work was of immeasurable value, though after this time she never had reason to use the German language again. For 2 years, Des focused on biblical prophecy. First, he submitted his topic, the abomination of desolation. So it was one of my favorite phrases as a kid. I'd go around at age 5, the abomination of desolation, the abomination of desolation. Abomination of desolation in the prophetic passages of Daniel in the New Testament, and Bruce gave the go-ahead. I'd get down on my knees and I'd pray for F.F. Bruce. Thought about it in the libraries, Des recalled. I thought on the train, as I walked, as I ate at the meal table, during church services, in the bathroom and toilet, and at night when I should have been sleeping. Once he and Bruce sat in Bruce's study discussing some of the research, and Des said he believed Daniel 8:14 is the pivotal verse in the book of Daniel because it summarizes the theme of the whole book, i.e. vindication. I haven't read the book of Daniel for 35, 38, maybe even 40 years. Every chapter, he maintained, pictures the saints in trouble until God intervenes and is vindicated. That is, God's saving power and his justice are vindicated as righteous. So the chat says, Vocab Malone did a stream about Seventh-day Adventism recently. Couple of ex-Adventists joined that have YouTube channels. And they mentioned my father. Okay, I'm going to skip the theology. While Des was caught up in the trauma of Gwen's illness and death, followed by his remarriage and preoccupation with studies at Manchester, significant developments in Australia were taking place that would influence the next decade. Okay, and then we got all this theological tornado by the name of Brinsmead. Prior to the papal visit to Australia in April 1970, Brinsmead had publicly questioned the right of the Australian government to spend so much taxpayers' money on a tour by a religious head. So Seventh-day Adventists tend to be anti-Catholic, particularly traditional Adventists. His protest made the local press and TV. Consequently, a local Roman Catholic dignitary challenged him to a debate, took up the offer, and threw himself into a study of Roman Catholic theology to prepare for the confrontation. And then we get a lot of theology, which I will skip. The speed with his research project was the more remarkable in view of the fact that serious domestic problems haunted Des. At a premarital checkup, Jill was advised to use a birth control pill that contains synthetic progestin. Threw her hormonal system into confusion. She described her condition as a periodic emotional fog, causing her to be panic-stricken and terrified. She wrote of the onset and worsening crisis. During our trip to England, Des and I had our first real argument, and I went into a gradually deepening depression and withdrew into sullen silences, punctuated by sudden, uncontrollable outbursts of anger, retreating into my bedroom for hours and days at a time. I started to question my marriage. I had thought that God had led me into marriage and that I had done the right thing, taking on the family, and suddenly it seemed like a disaster. Felt terrible that I was making everyone miserable. Went inside. I wanted to be part of their healing. Thinking back over that time years later, Paul is said to have remarked, there was a shadow over our home and I did not know what it was. For a decade, Jill tried all sorts of remedies, surgery for polycystic ovaries, different types of birth control pills, psychiatric treatments and antidepressants, and various hormonal supplements. Finally, regular implants of estrogen brought balance and relief to her body. That's about 1984 when she got well. But in the meantime, there were desperate times when Des, too, questioned the marriage. And it wasn't a bowl of cherries for the children either. Having finished writing his thesis, Des decided that they should make a tour of Europe with Paul and Luke, spent £40 on a second-hand car, and his fellow student Norman Young and wife Liz joined them. Proved to be the real rest that he'd sought for so long. When he returned to face the oral defense of his thesis, he succeeded without a hitch and was granted his PhD in theology at a graduation ceremony in December. So, got each of his doctorates in 18 months. Dedication of his thesis read, to the memory of Gwen Ford, who encouraged this project, though aware she would not live to see it, to Jill Ford, whose wholehearted help made the hope a reality. Des and his family, except for Len, arrived back at Avondale in something like December of 1972. Des was fully rested and eager to resume lecturing again in the familiar halls of Avondale College. So I remember England. We were there for 18 months, and then I remember returning to Avondale College the end of 1972. Once again, however, he found himself back among his persistent critics, and they stepped up their opposition, making the next few years a time of confrontation between Adventist fundamentalism in Australia and Des's clarion call for church members to accept the apostolic gospel. So one thing about intellectuals, like everyone else, they really like to feel important. Intellectuals tend to be very smart, and they tend to use their brains to critique existing systems and communities and ways of doing things. And this does not necessarily make them popular. So that's my non-theological understanding of my father's controversies. He had his 2 doctorates. He was very smart. He was very well read. And so he was ready to, he had more confidence in his ability to critique the church. All right, let's listen to a little of Jerry Wise, a therapist, talking. It's never too late to have a happy childhood, never too late to have a good relationship with your dad.
Present anymore. Their parent lives on within them. The parent lives on within us. He did not see this very clearly. Often we don't. And we feel our critical, shaming, abandoning subpersonality is just us. That's just us. It's just the way we think. That's just the way I am as an adult. And that it's justified and reasonable. You know, I should shame myself. Look how stupid I've been. I should criticize myself. Look how bad of a job I did. And they don't realize.
Okay, next chapter. Chapter 7, A Posse of Mossbacks. I don't know what a mossback is. Avondale College held an attractive ambiance for Des. Despite the loss of Gwen, it was a place of 1,000 happy memories. Early student days, friendships formed, vibrant classroom experiences, and its rustic setting. It was a joy to return to its halls in 1973. So yeah, my father was a pretty happy man at Avondale College, also at Pacific Union College in the Napa Valley. Des and his family settled in at Currans Road. Len was boarding with friends and continuing her studies. Paul, soon after arrival, flexed his independence, decided to go north to stay with the maternal relatives in Queensland. My brother dropped out of school at age 15, went to work, and made quite a success of himself. There he first worked with his uncles in real estate. Later, he partnered a plant nursery with an aunt. More recently, he has developed a very successful importing and wholesale business. Luke, of course, was only elementary school age and attended the campus school within walking distance of home. I remember my father walking me to my first day at 6th grade at Pacific Union College Elementary School and giving me advice: don't talk too much, be a good listener. And I'd earlier met my future classmates in the Pacific Union College pool, and I reacted to them by like splashing water in their faces. Very kind of a typical Fordian thing, or very typical Luke Fordian thing. So I'd already alienated my future classmates when we met in the college pool. And on my 2nd grade report card, it said, Luke is always very willing to share his opinions with the class, but he needs to learn to be more considerate of the slower thinker. Once again, Des took up his lecturing duties and frequent speaking appointments. Whenever time permitted, he wrote articles for the denominational press. These were carefully scrutinized by his critics, who made him a target of vilification. Des, however, was not the type to be intimidated by diatribes. He believed he had a contribution to the ongoing quest for truth. He did not hesitate to share it publicly. Just like me, if I believe I have a contribution to the ongoing quest for truth, I don't hesitate to share it publicly. Aren't you blessed? I remember I was kicked out of a synagogue in 1998 and kind of doubled over in pain at the news when I was meeting with the rabbi. This is Aisha Torah, meeting with Rabbi Moshe Cohen. And I said to him, wow, the sins of the fathers continued upon the sons. Because my father got kicked out of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Here I am converting to Judaism, getting kicked out of my favorite synagogue. And Rabbi Cohen pointed out that's only if the sons continue in the sins of the father. So he wasn't saying anything about my father. Rabbi Cohen doesn't know my father. It was just making a point about the meaning of that biblical text. Before Des left Manchester, the editor of the Australasian Signs of the Times, Bob Parr, had arranged with Des to publish a series on the Book of Daniel, a reflection on its major themes after the doctoral studies, especially the abomination of desolation motif. Okay, and there's a YouTube link for your father. The lyrics matter. Okay, song My Father's Shoes. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Parr had written with tongue in cheek, I'm well aware of the fact that you are to the right or to the left of Uriah Smith, W.M.R. Scraggs, who are like leading Seventh-day Adventist theologians, and sundry others. I know that the publication of your views of the King of the North sounds like Game of Thrones. Winter is coming. Armageddon and sundry other material will bring W.M.R. Scragg out in the full flurry of his confused penmanship. And when I defend what I am doing, he will thenceforth not speak to me for the space of some weeks. For this reason, I am not terribly upset. Indeed, I would not consider it a hell on earth if good old brother Scragg did not write to me very often. I emphasize that your series must be fairly simple. I believe that you will not plunge into the inner recesses of prophecy to such an extent that only those who have 4 PhDs will be able to interpret it. Be gentle on the Catholics and don't get into any confusion about the King of the North. Obviously, that is Japan or Communist China if you are not too fussy about magnetic North. So, Seventh-day Adventist eschatology is all obsessed about the King of the North. Here's Jerry Weiss talking about Never Too Late to Have a Happy Childhood.
Parent criticizing our inner child who's trying to do the best they can because it fits the facts we believe. No, this is our inner critical parent we grew up with continuing to give us a hard time, only now we have taken over the job for them. So what can we do to have a happy childhood now? Admit and realize we have an inner child who's still suffering and hurting from long ago. Change the patterns that you see and find. When you're being very depressed, angry, moody, weak, lost, resentful, look back and go, when did I first started feeling this way years ago? When did that start to happen? How long ago was that? Change the patterns that you find. You are now the parent. For example, if you have a voice of shame that shames you for every error you make, every imperfection, reduce or stop how much you listen to this voice and to these thoughts. You can reduce how much you hear that inner critical parent and say, I'm not going to listen to that parent anymore, or not near as much. I know one person I was working with, they came from a German background, and they called it their Brunhilde side. Not that I have any problems with anybody called Brunhilde, but that it represented a German, harsh, forceful rule that's harsh over their inner child. And they would recognize that, well, that's Brunhilde talking again. And so they named it so they could kind of identify that as a sub-personality of themselves and not take it so seriously or stop taking it at all.
Thanks, Jerry. Back to the book. Des subsequently churned out 12 articles in as many weeks on arrival back in Australia. Thank you for your marathon effort on Daniel. Parr responded, your stuff came this AM. I'm right glad I was to have it. Both my father and I are capable of churning out tremendous amounts of material, but it's not always of the highest quality. These articles were reprinted in Ministry Magazine, it's a Seventh-day Adventist publication, extending into 1974, and in 1975, the American These Times accepted submissions on the books of Genesis, Romans, and Colossians. He was also asked by the General Conference Sabbath School Department to begin preparing a Sabbath School lesson quarterly with a book to complement the same topic. Contact with denominational editors was cordial, especially with Bob Parr, who was sometimes invited to share in Fortean hospitality when visiting Avondale. So Bob Parr was one of my father's top 3 friends, along with Norm Young. Not sure who the third. Noel Mason. Noel Mason, probably in top 3. making light of Des's abstemious living habits while responding to Jill's invitation to dinner on one occasion. He kidded, "I know this invitation comes from your own generous heart, not from old spider scrawl, Des. I cannot tell you how I'm looking forward to that baked orange peel, but please limit me to 2 glasses of the strained celery water. It's heady stuff, and I have to play Heffron at golf on Sunday a.m., and I don't want a hangover." Yeah, Seventh-day Adventists had that really good celery water and baked orange peel. Parr asked my father, "Are you giving yourself a treat and coming on Saturday night to the concert? Or go on, give yourself a break, why don't you?" My father did not go out at night because he would get up at 3 a.m., so he was usually in bed by 8 p.m. Okay, so in my father's series on Daniel, following Parr's admonition to be kind to Catholics, for many of them read Signs of the Times, Des simply alluded to them as an illicit union of church and state in the Middle Ages. That's nice. There was this Seventh-day Adventist who accepted to graduate school, I think Vanderbilt, in the religion department, and they took him aside to let him know that hating on Catholics, as is typical of Seventh-day Adventists, is not on at our school. Another critic came to the fore at this time. A retired Australian minister, Llewellyn Jones, made a mild protest about 3 years earlier, raising an objection to the principle of dual fulfillments of the prophecies that Des used in an October 1969 ministry article. Okay, then we get a lot of theological arguments, and I'm going to skip them. For 12 months, Edward Heppenstall explored the possibility of Des teaching religion at Loma Linda University. Loma Linda University is the most liberal, easygoing Seventh-day Adventist institution in the world, of which I'm aware. But nothing came of it. California Adventism, very different from Australian Adventism. So Australian Adventism is strict, riven by controversies, much more of the traditional, distinctive brand of Adventism. California Adventism tends to be more dominated by liberal Adventists who are more in it for the lifestyle, and evangelical Adventists rather than fire-breathing traditional Adventists. Playing church sheriff, George Burnside had begun in the 1950s to gather around him a posse of extreme conservatives, first attracting the likes of fellow evangelist John Conley. Burnside's opposition to Des intensified after a confrontation over the doctrine of inspiration in the summer of 1969, which directly resulted in Burnside's demotion. Burnside set up a little printing press in his basement and began publishing anonymous leaflets against Des, thinking all the time that only his closest colleagues knew their origin. But a distinctive typeface layout, illustrations, and other features later identified the issues as Burnside's work. So my father was quite obsessed with his critics. He was the word Burnside and Standish and Colin Standish, Russell Standish, George Burnside. These all came up quite a bit in my father's house. So my father was not someone to abstain from feuding. And in the end, it cost him his place in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Feuding will kill you. One titled Dr. Ford, Doctor of Doubt, was a trivialized and erroneous caricature of Des. Burnside followed up with another scurrilous pamphlet in 1975, Dr. Des Ford's Dangerous Doctrines. Both issues were circulated freely at SDA camp meetings. Des was in a no-win dilemma. He chose to avoid endless dialogue with critics. He was branded as aloof, uncooperative, and having no real answers. On the other hand, if he found the time to engage his critics, the discussion seemed interminable with no promise of a satisfactory resolution. So I don't debate theology on this show. I don't debate matters of faith. It is pointless to argue matters of faith. Burnside's posse of elderly ministers continued to grow, though it's the human angle in this story that interests me. It's not so much the substance of the theological debate, as I'm not a Christian. Frank Braden made submissions to Wahroonga Church headquarters, alleging that Des and Jill were advocates of dissident views on the nature of Christ and righteousness by faith. Arthur Jacobson and Ron Heggie in the Currumbong district acted as self-appointed theological watchmen over Des and Avondale College. Nearby, Ormond Anderson, renowned as a wily mischief maker, actively smeared Des and Avondale while moving among the churches on the north and central New South Wales coasts. Frame appealed to Ormond's brother at General Conference offices in America to dissuade Ormond from gossiping, but there was simply a closing of ranks with Burnside. Two ministerial retirees in Sydney who were friends of Burnside, James William Kent and John Keith, familiar names in our household, then joined the fray. When they read Des's articles on Daniel, they recognized some new lines of argument. Crucial to the developing web of criticism was the entrance into the debate of the Standish twins, Colin and Russell. Russell was a medical doctor in Melbourne in close contact with Jones. He gathered information in Australia to pass on to Colin in America. Colin held a PhD, had lectured in Avondale's education department before transferring to Jamaica, then Columbia Union College in the shadow of General Conference headquarters. The real danger of the Standish twins lay in the fact that they were men with tertiary degrees who postured as if their training were in theology. So perhaps didn't hear any names of my father's critics more often in our home growing up than Colin and Russell Standish. Many of the laity were later to put their trust in this facade. Colin acted as one line of communication to church leaders in America, feeding them with information on the twists and turns in the ongoing saga in Australia. Were these critics intelligent and lucid men? Certainly. Were they loyal to the church? Yes. Were they trained theologians? No. They had an aura of pretense, but Des could never bring himself to say an uncharitable word about any of them. Well, that may be a bit of an exaggeration. He was honest. There are many of them that are good men, he once said. Their problem is their education. On another occasion, he said, Dr. Colin Standish is one of the finest Christians I know. I wish he could be multiplied a million times. He's a very fine Adventist and one whom I feel I could trust in any situation that is, bar the cause he has now espoused. Biblical support for a 6,000-year chronology. So my father had quite a way with words. Other Seventh-day Adventist theologians, most of them in harmony with Des, never attracted the same vitriol. That's because my father was a provocateur. He enjoyed demolishing people in argument. Here he is on a committee, and he'd be just straining at the bit. When he finally got to speak, he'd say, that's all very fine, but it's papist. In a Seventh-day Adventist upbringing, papist is the very strongest accusation you can make against someone. So there are plenty of other Seventh-day Adventist intellectuals who held the same views of my father, but for reasons of personal confrontation, rhetorical confrontation, my father developed very intense enemies, while other people with the same views as my father were more diplomatic in how they expressed their views, so they did not attract vitriol. So I think there are a lot of lessons there. You can hold your views. You can even express your views, but how you express them will make all the difference in whether or not you get into feuds. For 2 decades, the church had invested millions of dollars in higher education for their lecturers and youth, in addition to the infrastructure to operate it. So here's the problem. As Seventh-day Adventists get tertiary secular education, as they get BAs, masters, and PhDs from secular universities, then their commitment to the traditional teachings of the church wane, and usually within a generation or 2 or 3 at the most, their kids will move on completely out of the church. So Seventh-day Adventism tends to be very much a 3-generation phenomenon. First generation's fervent, traditional. Second generation, secularly educated and more liberal. Third generation, on its way out of the church. By the 1970s, the fruitage was evident. A wide gap had developed between the lecturers and graduates on the one hand and the older generation on the other. So those who went to secular universities became much more liberal in their religious outlook, while those who didn't get secular educations were more conservative and traditional. The graying church members generally knew of only two systems of biblical interpretation: the proof text method with generous lashings of literalism, and the accumulation of Ellen White quotations on any given topic. Okay, so that is the recipe for continuing Adventism. Once you move outside of that to a more scholarly and liberal approach, then you've already got one foot out the door. Similar thing has happened in Orthodox Judaism as Orthodox Jews have gotten more and more university educations. They've been more likely to become more liberal in their commitments to their religion and even drop out of Orthodox Judaism altogether. Probably Judaism has had the hardest time adapting to modernity of the three major faiths. Christianity has had probably the easiest time adapting to modernity. And Islam is the world's most powerful religion because it has the most adherents willing to kill in its name. Then why didn't other Bible lecturers who shared similar beliefs with Des attract the same criticism? It was because of his high profile in church publications and unwillingness to obfuscate, and his earnest quest to plug the many holes in SDA lines of argument. It was also his personality and his desire to crush his opponents in debate. And a bit of attention seeking on his part. Got the attention, but he didn't like all of it. This set him up as a shooting target. Other theologians were less communicative or would only say their piece on debated issues behind closed doors. Yeah, well, everything is context. You can speak very differently in one context than you can in another. And you can recognize that religious communities depend on statements of faith. You don't happen to share some of the foundational faith statements of your community. If you want to remain in your community, you need to keep quiet about it. If you make a frontal assault on your community's theological claims of distinction, you are inevitably going outside the church. I remember I always thought of my father as heroic and persecuted, and I was relaying this to a UCLA professor, Robert Louis Stevenson, and another UCLA professor, Jules Zentner, and I was at UCLA in 1988, 89, and they made the point that every religion has to stand for something, and if you can't stand with what your religion stands for, then it's only right that you leave. So it's such an obvious point, but I hadn't thought of it until then. Okay, let's listen to a little more Jerry Weiss, therapist. It is never too late to have a happy childhood and a great relationship with your own father.
It's never too late to have the parent you always wanted. You be the parent you always wanted. Be patient, accepting, non-shaming, loving, and attentive to your inner child within. Be to you what you wanted your parents to be to you. Then the child can have a happier childhood today. Treat your inner child like an inner child. This is a poor, innocent, sweet, weak part of you. Nurture it, love it, take care of it so that it can grow to feel more safe and strong and begin to grow up and develop. Remember, you have a wounded, hurt, scared little child inside.
Okay, thank you, Jerry Weiss. Perfectionism at the highest level. I've been accused of many things in my life. Nobody has ever accused me of perfectionism. And my dad has never been accused of perfectionism either. My father was constantly rushed sloppy, messy, chaotic chaos just kind of bounced off him. He spread chaos everywhere he went. The 1970s brought a double-barreled barrage. Issues over prophetic interpretations were packed into one compartment, while in the other lurked explosive issues regarding the doctrine of righteousness by faith alone. And I'm going to skip the theology. I'm going to skip a fecund period of gospel witnessing. It is reported that one young person, Noel Mason, my old friend, my father's old friend, one of my father's closest friends, handed a copy of Brinsmead's pamphlet, a letter to my SDA friends to Des soon after he arrived, which he read and then checked with the Reformation sources. He shared it with Norman Young, also recently returned from Manchester. As a result, Des came to see righteousness by faith in sharper focus. And we're going to skip. During these same months, Jill was teaching a Sabbath school class for young marrieds at the Kurumbong Village Church. The themes for the quarter's lessons included the nature of Christ and righteousness by faith. With two different views circulating among SDA believers, she found her class quite confused about the issues. Gathering material from Des, in addition to class notes she was taking in Norman Young's lectures at the time, she began composing a manuscript that grew to 50 pages, submitted to the 6 theology lecturers at Avondale College under the title, The Soteriological Implications of the Human Nature of Christ. So I think soteriological has to do with the mechanics of salvation. And it was subsequently used in college classes. Jill, a comparatively new SDA, innocently outlined what she had been taught by the minister who baptized her and what she had learned at Avondale. She did not deliberately set out to confront the perfectionists. And so a lot of people, the traditional Adventists, thought that this manuscript was Des's works and it was just being published under Jill's name. But my father certainly contributed, but my mother put it all together. Okay, so we've got all these pages on theology. Okay, we got a big meeting on righteousness by faith at Avondale College on February 3, 1976. And the full contingent of theology lecturers were present, along with their critics. Des was given right of reply to all papers presented by his critics. Whoa, thank you, Deplorable, for the super chat. The discussions at Avondale were civil, but the tone changed dramatically on the second day. Des listened patiently to the presentations and scribbled a few notes as papers were read by his antagonists. He had brought with him a suitcase full of Ellen White's books and other denominational literature. During the lunch break, he tore off little bits of paper, placed them in the pages of the books, marking excerpts he planned to read in the afternoon. After lunch, he launched into his answers, reading quotation after quotation that destroyed the positions held by his critics. One by one, he threw the books down on the table in front of them and challenged them to admit their error. Some of his closest colleagues felt he was too provocative. His assailants were livid. Burnside became blue in the face. Outside, office secretaries showed alarm, hearing shouting coming from behind the closed doors. It was a high point in the theological debate, a defining moment. After more than a decade of constant sniping, Des and his supporters were tiring of the barrage. They were emboldened to counterattack. So this is what happens when you counterattack and carry on feuds. Their victory, however, only caused the opposition to lick its wounds and hope to ambush on another day. Des, they determined, must be chased out of town. Predictably, at the end of the meeting, 22 voted in support of Des and 16 critics remained opposed. Okay, then we get to shilly-shallying at Palmdale. So Palmdale is about 90 minutes drive north of here. I remember my dad going to Palmdale, 1976. Des was to face one more fiery trial that year in 1976. So at this point, he would have been 47 years of age. He was born in 1929. The ongoing theological wrangling was not just with a tiny group of vocal critics in Australia, but also with a small and powerful group at American headquarters, specifically over the issue of righteousness by faith. Once again, the crux of the problem was the veracity and authority of Ellen G. White's writings. Des had been quietly dropped from the Biblical Research Committee. So he didn't like that. April 23 to 30, 1976, 19 men were scheduled to meet at Palmdale, an isolated and desolate spot in California, specifically to discuss the topic of salvation. Now, you may think that Palmdale is desolate, and you may think the topic of righteousness by faith and salvation is boring. But let me tell you, when you combine Palmdale with this kind of soteriological argument, then it's sterling stuff. Okay, so we got 19 Adventist scholars. Des was chosen to attend as a representative from Australia. And they had this big to-do over righteousness by faith. Another of the American delegation gave a presentation, and Des became so exasperated, he blurted out, well, that was Roman Catholic theology, lock, stock, and barrel. There's nothing more damning you can say as a Seventh-day Adventist than something is Catholic or Papist or Roman. That's the worst. Terrible. Some more timid souls were aghast. People pled with my father to go a bit easy on the American brethren. So one guy told my dad, you Australians play hardball, we Americans play softball. It was not wise to be so candid in public, but behind closed doors with such a vital topic at stake, someone had to spell it out clearly. At the close of the meetings, the participants agreed they would remain tight-lipped till a statement of proceedings and findings was published in the church press. However, someone leaked it to one of the Standish twins, who published it in America. Okay, that's the big Palmdale conference on righteousness by faith. And let's move on. Chapter 8 now. Most of that chapter 7 is on theology, and I'm just going to skip it. Okay, chapter 8, reactions to the Palmdale conference. The ambivalence of Palmdale was never conclusively resolved. It left a vacuum in the SDA church where the different views persisted, and the apostolic gospel could not be preached with consistent clarity. Okay, I'm skipping the theology. Skip. Okay, so Neil Wilson replaced Robert Pearson as General Conference President, something like 1977. So there are tides in the affairs of men. So, for example, the tide is going out on the alt-right right now. There's less freedom of speech. They're getting demonetized. They're getting shut down, as opposed to 2015 and 2016 when the alt-right felt ascendant. So there are also tides in the affairs of Seventh-day Adventism. Church has historically swung back and forth between its traditional distinctive teachings and a more liberal and accepting approach. So in the end, the traditionalists usually win out. Neil Wilson was a traditionalist. He was also a very canny political player. He has a very important role to play in my father's story. Let me play some more from Jerry Weiss. It's never too late to have a happy childhood and a great relationship with your dad.
And need support, love, acceptance, and attention to his or her needs. And they need that attention from you. We keep thinking everybody else needs to do this attention for us. No, it's what we need to provide. Be sure to take care of you first before you take on the task of taking care of others. Often we care for others like we would like us to care for ourselves. Don't do that. Care for yourself first and then give to others. But we care for others like we'd like to be cared for while denying it to ourselves. That's not good inner child work. Right? Earn your own self-trust. This will allow you to think and move outside your restrictive box.
Okay, back to the Des Ford story. I think we're about halfway through this book now. And more theology. Okay. There was a promised colloquium convened on October 3rd and 1979. Des was among the 150 individuals to gather in the General Conference Chapel. And this is a big theological to-do. Jill issued a hefty volume, Law, Guilt, and Grace. It was a set of 10 talks she had given soon after Palmdale. The series was meant to inform her local church friends of some of the foundational issues avoided at Palmdale, such as the depths of humanity's inherited sinful nature. Hey, if you're in here watching my videos, then you have no doubt about humanity and its depth of sinful nature, right? We understand the fallen nature of man, to use Christian language. Okay, lots and lots of theology here. So Bob Parr writes to my father. Now, Russell Standish, you may fondly imagine that God has called you to lead a mighty crusade against the Australasian division in general, against Avondale College, and against Dr. Ford. Okay, no, this is Jorgensen's comments to Standish. Please don't write to tell me you're only concerned with this theology and not with the man himself. Most of the brickbats that are being flown across my desk and occasionally graze my neck. So this is, I guess, is the local Adventist administrator, leader. Your campaign has alienated people from Dr. Ford and his ministry. Unless you can justify your action in the sight of God, you will be called to give account of the damage you have done him in the day of judgment. Bob Parr, who taught the Standish twins in their high school days, said he knew Colin to be a character who would crawl backwards over broken bottles to get into a fight. Very Australian characteristic. My father was pretty similar. Russell was no different. Bob Parr came to deplore their long, sanctimonious letters of complaint as humbug and a nuisance. Russell's frequent expressions, such as, I would be utterly grieved to forfeit your friendship, were taken by Parr to be hollow and mendacious. Bob Parr replied to Russell Standish, am I numbered among those favored mortals who have your smile of Christian affection? In view of what you have done to Pastor Jorgensen, your dear friend, and your other great buddy, Dr. Ford, I wonder whether such may not be the kiss of death. I'm not the dedicated Christian that my friend Desmond Ford is. You quote him as saying that if you hit him over the head with a crowbar, he would believe that it accidentally fell from your hand. Not me. If you hit me over the head with a crowbar, I would instinctively duck to avoid the second blow. Bob Parr, I think, writes here, Russell Standish and John Clifford were absolutely massacred. This is in a meeting on perfectionism. Brinsmead left them without a leg to stand on. I expected them to crawl under their seat and not come out until everybody had gone. On the contrary, the whole proceeding went right over their heads. They came out fighting, showing no suggestion their cause had been vanquished and left in shambles. Really marvel at the obtuseness of these two gentlemen. It is incredible. There is no other word that they could even hold up their heads in view of the documented evidence which Brinsmead produced and which laid them low after smiting them hip and thigh. So I have no interest in the theological truth here. It's all about the human drama. This is my father's life. And I'm interested in my father because he's a lot like me. I'm a lot like him. Okay, page after page of theological arguments that we're going to skip. The big skip. The continuing debate brought no relief for Des personally, simply isolated him further as American officials and Australian critics united in their push for perfectionism. There's a question in the chat, was my father saved? So I don't think in those Christian terms I am convert to Orthodox Judaism. I don't lose any sleep about whether or not people are saved. It simply isolated my father further as American officials and Australian critics united against him. Some administrators imagined the transfer of Ford from Avondale College would provide the answer to the problem. This would prove to be a short-sighted resolution. Avondale had an affiliation agreement with its sister institution, Pacific Union College in California. Both colleges felt that the agreement was for mutual benefit. Among other features, it involved a regular exchange of lecturers. The plan was for Des to spend 2 years at Pacific Union College while Des retained the title of the head of the theology department at Avondale. Both Des and Jill were happy about the prospect of transfer. Constant battle with mossbacks had discouraged Des at times because it was so time-consuming and apparently fruitless. I don't think my father engaged in much introspection about what role did he play in these feuds. What role did he play in provoking people? Were there ways that he could say what he believed that would be less hurtful, less provocative, and less offensive to others? Don't think my father engaged in much introspection on that score. A change of paddock presented some hope of relief. Guess what? Wherever you go, there you are. If you are alienating people in one place, creating constant controversy and chaos, then you move to another place, you'll likely alienate people there and cause constant controversy and chaos. There is no geographic solution to a spiritual problem. There is no religious solution to a spiritual problem. There's no physical solution to a spiritual problem. Des understood, however, that the move would be made on two conditions: that he would be invited to sit on the American committee designated to resolve problems relating to the sanctuary doctrine, that his return to Avondale College would be guaranteed after the 2-year stint. So arrangements for Des to begin lecturing at PUC in September of 1977 were made. When word reached California that Des would be teaching at PUC, it created genuine excitement in some quarters. One church member who had read some transcripts of talks given by Des was thrilled that another gospel voice was coming into their midst. He warned there was a small vocal minority that promoted perfectionism. Another cloud on the otherwise sunny horizon was that Owen Gain vigorously opposed the coming of Des to PUC. Prior to Des's arrival, Owen Gain canvassed all the board members at PUC, numerous college and church officials in a vain attempt to reverse the transfer agreement. So I was friendly with Roy Gain, incredibly impressive young man, did a PhD in Hebrew under Rabbi Jacob Milgram at University California at Berkeley. And Roy Gain is now a leading Seventh-day Adventist Bible scholar at the seminary in Berrien Springs, Michigan. Very impressive young man, very impressive wife. Gaines are a very impressive family. Owen Gain informed Des. So they used to be friends, but then they had a very strong falling out. I've taken the position that it would be unwise for you and me to be together in the same Bible department. Hence, I am opposing your coming to PUC. If our board votes to have you come, I will hand over my work to you or take some other position, at least for the period of your stay. Des did not see Gaines' petulance as an insurmountable problem. He was quite happy to work alongside someone with a different viewpoint. Des was an optimist, always believing that the Spirit could persuade anyone to accept the gospel. Thank you, Halsey. Regardless of anything, you're a shining light for your family name. Thank you so much, Halsey. After all, he had witnessed the dramatic turnabout in the Brinsmead family. Okay. On May 25, 1977, just before his departure for America, Des addressed the division staff in their morning devotional. His parting gospel message ended with these words: "We cannot climb to heaven by the quaking sides of Sinai. Way is too narrow, one slip will destroy us." Okay, and that's the end of chapter 8. Now, chapter 9, lecturing at Pacific Union College. So we moved to Pacific Union College at the end of May 1977. I just turned 11 years of age, May 28. Chapter 9, lecturing at Pacific Union College. When Dr. Ford left Avondale College, his colleagues were heartened by the belief that he would soon return. Little did anyone realize, least of all Ford himself, that his gospel ministry would be magnified in ways that confounded his critics. Where can you get the book? So the book is Desmond Ford, reformist theologian, gospel revivalist. You can get it from Adventist Today, I think atoday.com, but just Google Adventist Today or Google the title of this book, and you'll find out where you can get a copy. I think it's only like $25. Mid-1977 found Des, Jill, and Luke settling into their new campus surroundings at Pacific Union College. Des would walk the mile or so to classes or pedal his bicycle. The Americans welcomed them wholeheartedly. We had a wonderful time at PUC, Jill later recalled. So when we arrived at PUC, we didn't believe we needed a car. So I think our whole 3 years there, we never had a car. We would go to the grocery store and carry our groceries home. And when we visited San Francisco, we took the bus. Didn't enjoy taking the bus around. And we didn't get a phone for about a year until people would just show up at our door because we didn't have a phone. Okay, so yeah, let's show some pictures of my dad at this time. So here we go. Oh. So my father, the preacher man. In his first academic year, 1977-78, Des was given a teaching load of 40 units, including the Pauline epistles, life and teachings of Jesus, Daniel, Revelation, and Hebrew prophets of the post-Babylonian era. So my father was always a hard worker, very hard worker. The only adverse criticism from the students was his lack of availability, because speaking appointments took him away from campus so often. So people always wanted more from my father than he physically could give. He just didn't have enough time. People were always pestering him, and it's a very bad idea to ask people for more than they can give. Never ask more from a friendship or an acquaintanceship than people are able to give, because then you're putting strain on something, on a thin reed that can't handle it. And it seemed like a lot of people wanted more from my father than he was simply able to give. His style was the same as at Avondale, energetic, stimulating. Whenever possible, he was accustomed to taking his classes outside into the healthy sunshine and fresh air. His bonhomie won the hearts of his. My father was very happy at Pacific Union College. Des's presence on campus was felt almost immediately. Jack Castle recalled, that's the president of Pacific Union College. Theology students flocked to his classes. Des agreed to teach a Sabbath school class on campus soon after his arrival. It did not take long before there was standing room only. So when I went back to visit Pacific Union College in 2007, they showed me and took me to the room where my father would teach Sabbath school. I had forgotten which room. Jack Castle attended on many occasions, commented that soon members of the community were flocking to the class. He had to remove to the largest lecture room on campus in the science complex. Students, faculty, retired ministers, and visiting parents were enthralled by his presentations. So yes, my father was a gifted public speaker. Des was also invited to conduct a series of 12 week of prayer meetings on campus in October, November of 1977. He titled them The Gospel, Weight or Wings. Okay, are we back on the air? I hope the show is still going. We had a little technical difficulty there. Okay, let's see if we're still going. Fred Veltman regarded my father as a revivalist, both in and out of the classroom, best suited to the proclamation of the gospel and less inclined to spend many hours correcting grammar and lack of logic in student essays. My father hated correcting student essays and marking papers. Speaking invitations began to flood in from all over America and Europe, far too many for Des to accept. Weekend engagements found him away from the college more often than not. These received warm accolades from church officials and members, but some on campus began to complain that he was absent too often. I didn't complain that my father was gone. Like that didn't cause me any distress. I didn't need my father to be around. My happiest memories have always been away from my parents. So, say from about age 6 on, my father did not play much of a role in my life. I didn't find myself looking forward to his company. If I saw my father hurrying towards me, it was never it was rarely a good thing. It was usually to reprimand me for something. It was never to, oh, let's go play cricket, or let's watch a movie, or let's do this or that. It was usually to lay some assignment on me or lay some reprimand on me. So we were not particularly close. And when he was away traveling, I was not unhappy about it. Okay, just as in the days of Lawrence Naden and Avondale College, Jack Castle had to restrict the times Des could be away on appointments. So Jack Castle, who was president of Pacific Union College when we were there, he was interviewed about a few years after his retirement, sometime like 2005, 2008. He said one of the things that struck him that differentiated the modern Pacific Union College from the one that he used to run was that premarital sex was much more common. So when I was at Pacific Union College in the late 1970s, there wasn't this ethos or this energy of erotic excitement on campus. Most Seventh-day Adventists at this point were not having premarital sex, but that changed in the 80s and 90s. Though I remember being shocked one day. I was at the Pacific Union College swimming pool, and the lifeguard and this very long-haired college student were talking about being at a disco the night before. So being at a disco dancing is a sin in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But I'm finding out here that college campuses, college students are seriously sinning. It was a bit of a shock for me. It was a shock for me to find out that Christians were having premarital sex and even living together without marriage. Premarital sex, says Warriana, is there any other kind? Sir, for that, you get a wrench. You are now a moderator in this channel. For Des's second year at PUC, it was agreed he would be off campus only once a month, and Castle himself would field the numerous requests coming in. Fornication is a hell-bound act. Do you know that fornication doesn't receive any mention in the Hebrew Bible? Fornication is an obsession of the New Testament and of Christians and of Christianity. It is not an obsession of Orthodox Jews, rabbis, or traditional Judaism. Fornication, not a word used by traditional Jews. Now, by the way, most Orthodox Jews are virgins when they get married. Additionally, Des would be permitted to take 2 separate weeks of prayer per year at other SDA institutions. In view of the good name Des brought to PUC at these speaking appointments, had his teaching load reduced to 34 units the 1978-79 college year so that he would not become emotionally exhausted. Okay, let me give you some more pictures here of my father. That's with my mother. That's it. Then that's my father's wedding, 1970, with my mother. There I am. This is the 1970s, Des. Yeah, my father was a Christian, and he very definitely preached against fornication. Sexual sins for most conservative Christians are regarded as the very worst of sins, worse than torture and murder and theft and like sexual sins. They're the very worst. Okay, that's my father at PUC. Okie dokie. Off-campus appointments during Des's first year at Pacific Union College had included the winter quarter week of prayer at Walla Walla College, 3 lectures on righteousness by faith at Andrews University, during a weekend in February 1978, a series of 18 meetings at Monterey Bay Academy and Loma Linda University, and a summertime Nebraska camp meeting. In his second year, his appointments included a series in Alaska and week of prayer meetings at Atlantic Union College. One writer reported glowingly in the college newspaper, Ford presented Christ and his merits with a strength and clarity I've seldom heard. The impact of his messages still echoes in my mind, and the freedom with which he exalted the crucified and risen Christ gave an undeniable evidence that God's Spirit was with us throughout the weekend. Many students remarked that they had seen Christ in a totally new way. Castle said, I received many positive responses from educational institutions, North American unions, and conferences regarding his positive impact on his audience and expressing support for his emphasis on justification. I believe American Adventists were hungry for the revival of this historic Christian doctrine and were tired of the attention to such minutiae as skirt length, wedding rings, public displays of affection, and rigid Sabbath observance. So remember, my brother took a friend to church at Avondale College in the 1970s, and some lady came out with a tape measure to measure the length of the skirt of his friend. That was too short. So this was much more an obsession of Australian Adventists and traditional Adventists than more liberal Adventists. At the Pacific Union College swimming pool, 2-piece bathing suits, of course, were forbidden. Even if they were very modest 2 pieces, you were given a T-shirt that you had to wear over the top. Okay, back to Jerry Weiss. Never too late to have a happy childhood.
You have kept yourself in all these years. After your inner child feels strong enough to trust you, then you can begin to explore the world and the new world around you. Don't be so over serious about everything. Often we have come to believe that everything around us is all or nothing, or equate it to my survival or health as an adult. For example, coming to see if my parents are limited in how they are able to love me now as an adult, and that's fine. It's not that serious, and it's not required for me to be a healthy, happy adult. You don't need the love and acceptance of your parents. If you get it, it's wonderful, and I would encourage any parents to give that to their children, adults or child. But as an adult, no longer is that required for you. For example, if I don't do this presentation perfectly, I will lose any opportunity for future chances to market myself. No, this is a good opportunity, but it is not the end of the world if I blow it. For example, if my husband leaves me, I will be left all alone and will be shamed with no one who cares about me, and no one's going to give a hoot about my life. No, I cannot determine if he will leave me or not. I can't decide that. That's for him to decide. All I can do is the best that I can. If he leaves me, my life will not be over. I will find support and love from people who care about me. Family, friends, co-workers, children, and most important.
Okay, we've got calls to call in, so let me set that up. I will set up a call in. Hang on. So, okay, while I'm setting up the call in, I better play something that you can listen to. Take just a minute. And what do we have here? So I'm reflecting on my father's life. And let's go to the library here. Okay, let's go to Shapiro, Mark Shapiro. Big fan of Mark Shapiro. He's a historian, a scholar.
Welcome everyone back to the next, our newest session. We put in these chat. Rabbi Kelman is here with us. I don't know if Rabbi Kelman wants to say hello or anything. Yes. Okay, well, maybe not, or maybe he'll get on in a little bit. Welcome everyone back to, it's probably maybe the 5th year now of Torah in Motion. This will be a class, a smaller class of 6. Maybe that is why we have a smaller crowd. I'm not sure, but I know more people have signed up and will be coming. We are going to, this semester, start with the Rav Avram Shmuel Sofer, the Katav Sofer. We're picking up where we left off. I only have, I think, one class today on the Katav Sofer. Then we're going to have a class or two about a figure, Moshe Kunitz, a relatively minor figure, but you'll see how he fits into what we've been doing, because he also is Hungarian. And then we move on to a major figure. That's Rav Meir Simcha of Levinsk, the Or Sameach, who will take us to the end of the semester, maybe even into the following semester. The following semester, we're going to do Rabbi Shlomo Yosef Zevin, and I'm still not sure about the others. I might do Rav Aaron Cutler. There's a number of figures I've been thinking about. Maybe the Netziv, Natalia Yehuda Berlin. But let us get right to it. We're in the middle of our discussion of.
Okay, that's Mark B. Shapiro, favorite author of mine, and now got the call in activated, so you can call in. And the number to call in is 310 997 4596. 310 997 4596. It's all activated, so you can call in if you want. All right. Back to the book by Milton Hooke on my father, Desmond Ford, reformist, theologian, gospel revivalist. And the question in the chat is, why did I abandon the Christian faith, Luke? Wow. Okay. Big question. So I just took it for granted that Christianity was true until about age 18 when I went back to Australia for a year after high school, and I really wanted to have that premarital sex. So Christianity, as I understood it, kind of got in the way of pursuing the sex that I wanted. So I dropped Christianity, became an atheist, but there was no sex, no sex for me for 4 more years. But I was an atheist. I was all ready to have lots and lots of sex, but I was too socially awkward and too scared to actually step into it. So finally got to have some sex after 4 years of atheism. And by that time, however, my health had collapsed and my life had collapsed. So I was looking for a way back to God. And I think I was looking for a way back to God that did not include my father's approach. So then I encountered Judaism at UCLA, and Judaism spoke to me. And it was a way to kind of get away from my father's influence, everything he taught, and find my own way to God. So, wow, I set up the call in, took the time, and then no one's calling in. So I'll just leave the call in for about 1 more minute, and then I'm going to turn it off. So call in now if you want to call in. Okay, going to skip the theology. Inevitably, Des would stir up some opposition. Owen Gain had already scattered tars before Des set foot on campus, but these lay dormant in the field of instant popularity for Des. How galling it must have been for Gain. And again, there was very little reflection on my father's part on what was he doing, how was he conducting himself, how was he expressing himself, what did he do to fuel these feuds and to provide energy and focus and inspiration for his critics to try to take him down. Gain earned the reputation of being a prima donna. Administration had told him his resignation would be accepted if he did hand it in because of Des coming to PUC. Same time, they knew he desperately wanted to keep teaching. They called his bluff, and he did not carry through on his threat to resign. He lingered in the theology department with a down-in-the-mouth attitude and continued to sow seeds of discontent, because from his perspective, he was simply standing up for the Christian truth. On a number of occasions, Castle called the department faculty together to discuss the righteousness by faith issues. Gain resented having to attend these meetings. I'm sure my father resented having to attend them too. No harmony was achieved, and all remained locked into their own views. One thing my father said about me, said that I was more willing to change my mind than anybody he'd ever known. Des made a personal approach to Gain, pleading, "Can't we walk together at PUC, even though we disagree?" No, was Gain's retort. Gain treated Edward Heppenstall with a similar attack of the grumps. It troubled Heppenstall and led him to confront Gain with a gracious letter. Whenever I've had speaking appointments at Pacific Union College, or more particularly study sessions with the men in the Bible department at the retreats with your theology students, you've invariably absented yourself. Naturally, I asked openly, why this attitude on your part? Time and again, I was told by your fellow teachers that since you disagreed with me theologically on certain points, and thereby disapproved of me, this was your way of registering your opposition to me. Oh, we've got a caller. Hey, this is exciting. So let's see here. Okay, caller, you're on the air. Welcome.
Yeah, I mean, you got a really interesting story, and it's kind of perplexing to me because you said that you're a raised Christian. You decided upon your own accord to go atheist, and to kind of divert your father, you were going to come back to religion, but as in Judaism, correct?
Correct.
Well, I mean, if that was the case, like, why not stay atheist? I don't understand that if the whole point is to, divert your father. Well, I mean, he's not atheist, so problem solved.
Well, the problem is that we're delving in the very murky realm of motivation. So, as this particular show is largely about my father, I kind of frame my answer to your question more in terms of my father. At the time that I made these moves, I had no conscious uh, decision to distance myself from my father or to go in a different direction from my father. I'm just trying to understand my unstated motivations, but I think it is normal for kids to want to approach God, religion, and life in a different way than their father. So I consciously did not do any of these things because of my father. What I did find in Judaism was a path to God that spoke to me and that made more sense to me than Christianity.
Okay, but I mean, in Judaism, of course, the Old Testament is still in play, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the battle in heaven was still waged and all that stuff, right?
Right. It just doesn't have the same emphasis. So even though both Christians and Jews believe in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, as Christians call it, they have completely different emphases. So the emphasis in Judaism is on the laws of the Sabbath, the laws of what you can eat, the laws of how you build a sanctuary, the laws on how you dress, the laws on how you do business. The emphasis in Judaism is on the law, and the stories are of secondary importance. In Christianity, the emphasis is on the stories, and the law is of secondary importance.
Yeah. But, I mean, you're still constructing a religion that was based in a war from an angel who didn't have free will, that abuses free will in a place that doesn't have sin and sinned against God and got cast out. And he did that without temptation present because he is the source of temptation.
Okay, let me just jump in there. So, number one, it's not really useful to think of Judaism primarily as a religion. It is primarily a tribe. Jews are primarily a tribe, and the tribe has religious traditions which a minority of its members practice or hold to. But this was the way the ancient peoples had their own tribal religion. Now, religion is a separate category from tribe, except for Jews and Judaism. But Judaism is not primarily a religion, it is a way of life for a particular tribe. Second, this notion of fallen angels, conflict in heaven, this is not in the Bible. This is something that Ellen White wrote about and other people have speculated about, but it's not to be found in the Bible. So it's not a part of Judaism. Okay, back to you, caller.
So I can go to a synagogue and be like, "Hey, you guys aren't really doing a religion. This is a tribe."
No, I didn't say that Judaism is not a religion. I said it is not primarily a religion. It is primarily a tribe.
Pretty much, that's exactly what you said. I mean, I'll go back and watch this transcript, but you pretty much said Judaism is not a religion.
Right. I mean,
which is weird from
right.
a Jewish guy, you know.
Well, I'm trying to clarify it. So if I was to be more,
I'm here saying like, white people aren't a culture, or, you know, like.
Yeah, Judaism is not primarily a religion. It's primarily a tribe that has religious traditions that some members believe and some members practice. But it's more useful to think of Judaism as a tribe than as a religion.
I think that's very offensive to call Judaism a tribe. I mean, I don't know any tribes that still. That's a very primitive word that you're just blanketing an entire religion and saying, one, it's not a religion, and two, you guys are tribes or a tribe, you know, like a conglomerate tribe.
Well, tribe is simply an extended family.
That's really, I'm not Jewish, but I would be very upset if I was listening to this. Like, that's pathetic. Like you honestly probably should be censored off of YouTube for making these racist comments. I mean, I'm beyond myself. I'm not even Jewish.
Okay, it offends you, but I'm 52 years of age and nothing has offended me in my life. So if you hear a contrary point of view that offends you, that's on you. So Jews are quite comfortable with understanding themselves as a people. A people is another way of saying a tribe.
My Jewish friends up right now and be like, hey, tribal members, you guys, you don't have a religion because it's a tribe.
Well, it all depends on how you frame it and what is the nature of your friendship with these people.
I framed it exactly how you framed it, I think.
No, not quite.
You're the one with the public audience that's just calling Judaism a tribe and not a real religion. I mean, and I'm supposed to defend what you misspoke? I mean, come on.
I don't care. I don't care if you defend. I don't care what you do. I'm not asking you to defend, or I'm not asking you for anything. I'm making a note that depending on your relationship with people, how you say things will be heard in different ways. So there are all sorts of things that you can say to someone with whom you have a good relationship that you can't say to someone with whom you have a shallow relationship. To you, tribe is a primitive word. To you, saying that Judaism is primarily a people rather than a religion, that this is an offensive put down. But that's because you're coming at it from a Christian perspective, where Christian theology is more important than anything else. So I want to continue.
So the fact that like there's no tribes in the 21st century anywhere ever, like that's not what's offensive. It's the fact that I was indoctrined in Christianity, and therefore I view the word as tribe as something primitive, right? It has nothing to do with the fact that you can't name a tribe that is still in effect and existing today, correct? You're right.
There are plenty of tribes today. Okay, I'm going to go to the next caller, but I'm keeping you on. I'm just returning you to the queue. So I'm going to come back to you if you're interested. I'm just going to return you to the queue. Hang on.
Yeah.
Oh, well, you're a charmer. I'm just going to drop you. Okay, let's go to... Okay, caller, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hey, Luke, this is Moonman. The previous caller never heard, I guess, of like the Zoroastrians, the Parsis, right?
Yeah.
Who are also a tribe in many senses. There are some in the suburbs of the city where I live right now. There's, I don't know, like 100,000 of them or something in the United States. But like, they have an ethno-religion that's a lot like Judaism, in that most of them don't even practice it in a religious sense, but they have a strong sense of tribal identity. There are other groups in the Middle East that are like that too, like the Yazidis, the Druze. Trying to think of other groups that are like that. But yeah, like I would say that the Roman Catholic Church made a pretty concerted effort to eradicate tribes that existed among the Franks and the Goths and the other barbarians after the collapse of the Roman Empire, and that maybe is part of why we don't have tribes in Western Europe, certainly, anymore. But like, I don't know, the Arabs definitely have tribes, even to this present day. If you ask an Arab tribe you belong to, if you're sort of comfortable with them, or whenever I have cab drivers or Uber drivers, right, I can tell if they're Nigerian, and I'm getting very good right now at guessing their tribe. If you get their tribe correctly, or you get their tribe, or you say, or maybe you guess them from a higher status tribe than they actually are, they'll actually appreciate it quite a bit. They don't think of it as primitive at all. So,
yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely. No, you're making great points.
So, that's I don't know, like Jews actually practice Judaism, right?
Yes.
Maybe they go to some holidays, but I certainly did not up at all.
Yeah.
Not even a little bit. So,
it's primarily people. It's not primarily a religion. It's primarily a people or a tribe.
And if you walked into a synagogue and you started telling the people in the synagogue that they're not members of a religion, you're speaking to the people who are clearly practicing it as a religion. B, you're just some outsider who walked up off the street and is all of a sudden sort of minimizing their identity. Right? Either of those things are sort of the neutral vantage point from which, like, your concept Judaism is trying to be assailed. It's a pretty crazy small brain call you got right there. But I'm wondering if there's some mechanism for people to suggest readings to you and Kevin. I have a couple of good ones.
Yeah, just email me. Yeah.
The CIA archives are being progressively declassified. I don't know if it's 20 years or 30 years now. They have publications, kind of magazines, journals, right, that they publish for CIA employees about all kinds of like anthropological issues or economic issues, and they've opened them to the public from sort of like blanket FOIAs. And there are some of them from the 60s and 70s that are really quite based. And I think they're kind of interesting. So I'm going to speak a couple of those.
Great.
Rise to the level of significance. So, pleasure talking to you.
Okay, man. Take care. Good to talk to you. Okay, we got another caller here. So let's go to new caller from Los Angeles. Go ahead. How's it going? Okay. So phone line still open, still taking your calls at 310-997-4596. That's 310-997-4596. Okay. Let's see what's next here. Okay, this is a letter from Edward Heppenstall to my father's arch enemy, Owen Gain. Now, if this is true, it is incredible to me, since such an attitude would be so far removed from what I personally find essential in Christian fellowship and understanding. But this was the consensus not of just one man in your Bible department, but almost all of them. I do not like this kind of alienation. So this is a Seventh-day Adventist theologian complaining to another Seventh-day Adventist theologian that because they have theological differences, therefore they can't even walk together. So that's the challenge when your religion is based on theology rather than personal relatedness. So you walk into a synagogue, you're welcome, whatever your position on same-sex marriage, marginal tax rates, whether or not you're a Zionist, whatever your position on abortion, free speech, whatever your politics, if you're Jewish, you're welcome into a synagogue. So Christians, by contrast, they were killing each other in the first 3 centuries of Christianity over arguments about Christian theology. Judaism, by contrast, was approximately 3,000 years old before a rabbi came along and tried to formulate what Jews should believe. So theology does not receive a great deal of attention, even in Orthodox Jewish life. It's not a focus for Jewish intellectuals. Judaism, the Jewish way of life, is much more focused on behavior, on rituals, on practice, on the way you live your life, rather than on the mechanics of how you should believe about God. Okay, so here you see the problems that Christian churches, they split down the middle over questions on doctrine, questions over abortion, gay marriage, etc. And synagogues, by contrast, they don't split, generally speaking, over questions of theology. Owen Gain had one or two sympathizers, the most prominent being Morris Venden. He was the pastor of the Pacific Union College campus church, where I went to every Saturday. Des was often away and missed some of Venden's jibes from the pulpit. Jill, however, sat through most of them. In one sermon, she listened to a Venden parable about an Edsel car. She was unfamiliar with an Edsel, so the story went completely over her head. Later, a church member explained to her that the car was a Ford model taken off the market because it was no good. Cheap shots like this were unworthy of any man, especially one who preached perfection of character. Members of the congregation visited him, asking him to stop his attacks on Desmond Ford, but their pleas went unheeded. So it's kind of weird when you go to a church and the preacher of the church is attacking your dad. Venden habitually gathered Ellen White quotes and then used scripture to support them. Okay, who cares about the theological arguments? My father wrote to him saying, "Your preaching warms my heart, but it also troubles me. You think it's worthwhile to discuss these things, I am at your service." Venden, however, exhibited a certain swagger, and Des could make little impact on his pie-in-the-sky perfectionism. So as for the feud between Owen Gain and my father, other members of the theology department found them both equally stubborn, both equally unwilling to hear varying points of view. It's not like Owen Gain was just this bad guy and my father was this like saintly guy and everyone was siding with my father. Not at all. So this feud between Owen Gain and my father, this feud between my father and his critics, just absolutely exhausted members of the Pacific Union College faculty and community. Best to stay away from feuds. Jack Castle, the college president, observed that Ford never actively solicited support for his views to mount a blitzkrieg on his opposition. He always presented a phenomenal resilience to his antagonists, confidently going about his teaching and preaching with infectious buoyancy. And his literary output left him no time for cabal or politics. There's something to this. Drawing on some of the topical and typical questions posed by young minds in the classroom, Des published a paper back in 1977 with the title Answers on the Way, which Pacific Press Publishing had asked him to write. Okay, this is a book largely on theology. Gonna skip the contents. During the winter months of 1978-79, Des was granted a sabbatical to do further research for his companion volume on the Book of Revelation. And so Des was brought to the brink by his research in 1979. Back among his colleagues at Pacific Union College, writing and lecturing, he confided in some of them, saying he would lose his job when the commentary on Revelation was published. Ford had also written studies for a Sabbath school lesson quarterly scheduled for publication in 1980. Countless hours went into the draft. He also wrote a book to supplement the pamphlet series of studies. When the series was in an advanced stage of production, the enterprise was abandoned. But the book itself was later issued under the title Physicians of the Soul. Des made numerous inquiries to find out the cause of aborting the pamphlet series, concluded the evidence pointed to Keith Parmenter, Seventh-day Adventist administrator. So it's an early sign that official efforts were being made to strangle Des's influence. So under the new General Conference President, Neil Wilson, there was a much more conservative tide flowing into the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And my father was affected by this tide. And this was a bitter blow to my father, and it played a role in him speaking out, and that cost him his job. Into the mix of researching, writing, teaching, and preaching, the arrival of humorous letters from Bob Parr felt like the summer rain on parched earth. This is absolutely correct. My father loved Bob Parr and loved his letters and would just laugh uproariously over them. There was reason for continual contact because Des was still a regular contributor to the Australian church magazines. Apparently, Parr learned that Des's teenage son, Luke, that's me, was a keen marathon athlete. Neither Des nor Jill had urged Luke to adopt the sport. In fact, they both strongly discouraged it. But Bob Parr made light of the news, writing to Des, "I noticed that you have Luke on this running business. I beg of you, get the child to desist, and you too. You are 50 now. To have a small child run 26 miles under the threat of getting no food unless he finished first. That is too much. You are the most intemperate man I ever met. God gave you legs to walk upon, but you must run. He gave you the nights to sleep, but you must get up and study. He gave you children to bring you joy and gladness, and you send them out on 26-mile runs. Shame on your worthless head. 26 miles indeed. I think twice before I go that far in the car." I finished 5 marathons when I was 12 years of age. Okay, I'm going to hang up the phone line and go on with the regular show. Parr also relayed to Des some of the ongoing criticism that it was relentless whenever a general conference. So the Seventh-day Adventist is hierarchical. Judaism is congregational. So basically each congregation decides things for itself. Seventh-day Adventism is hierarchical, like the Catholic Church. There's a general conference president at the top, and then the church from the top hierarchically decides everything else. So my father was still very controversial. And here is Raglan Marx writing to my father. "Get back to the plain, straightforward books printed by the SDAs. Forget the so-called scholars and great scholars and commentators and the like. We've always rejected God's message, and many of whom are out-and-out liberals and modernists, Roman Catholics and Plymouth Brethren, and even thinly veiled agnostics. And what do you produce? A lot of confused, wearisome nonsense." Colin Standish visited Australia from America in the southern summer of 78-79. During that time that George Burnside and James Kent were banned from preaching because they were becoming so strident in their denunciations of officialdom, they still wanted Des axed. The ban was quickly lifted due to pressure from the other critics. And Colin Standish came well informed of the American situation, where there was a developing polarization. This polarization was not just theological. It was also about egos. It was about presentation. It was about narcissism. It was about attention seeking. And Standish's tactic was to enlist the help of his friends in general conference circles and thus bring further pressure to bear to act against Des. In America, Ford's critics were found in isolated pockets and were not marshaled under one banner, unlike Australia. Ralph Larson at Loma Linda Campus Hill Church is known to preach the sinful nature of Christ. Paradise Church near Pacific Union College was perhaps the most sharply polarized group at the time. Some members had paid for Russell Standish to travel from Australia to address them, but their conference president put a stop to it. Des was also invited to speak at Paradise, but on learning of the divided nature of the congregation, he chose to decline the offer, not willing to inflame the situation. A lady in Canada became upset about my father and what she termed the new orthodoxy at PUC. Challenging Castle, she asked, is there any assurance that PUC is going to purge itself from any and all faculty members who oppose the historic Adventism? Castle made a good defense. If you have a complaint against Dr. Ford, I would suggest you follow the biblical injunction in approaching Dr. Ford directly in an effort to better understand his theology and to become better acquainted with a man who, in my opinion, is a dedicated Seventh-day Adventist minister of the gospel. The real source of opposition to the preaching of righteousness by faith still lay at headquarters. And vital support was withdrawn from my father, so it wasn't just a theological dispute, it wasn't just an ego dispute, it was also a political and administrative dispute, and there are tides in the affairs of men, and the tide was going out on my dad's days in Adventism. Mid-1978, Keith Parmenter, who I think ran the Australian Adventist Church at the time, complained that tapes of Des's sermons were being freely circulated in Australia. My father responded, there is no copyright on talks given by Adventist ministers and anyone can reproduce them. PUC Church Tape Library sent out thousands of my talks to folks in distant countries. Okay, my father, very much in the line of fire. After his second year at PUC, Parmenter wrote to my father, has felt it'd be best for you to continue your service overseas for a longer period if this can be arranged. If not, we may need to study the possibility of using you in evangelism or pastoral work for a period of time. In other words, my father could not go home again. He could not go back to Avondale College. Clearly, the promise of a 2-year period was an empty one. So my dad could not go home again. The hearts of both Des and Jill were broken by Parmenter's letter. My heart was not broken. I loved living in America. They wrote impassioned defenses. Jill first told Parmenter, we already knew that you did not want us to return. I had spoken to Dr. Castle and knew you had made an official request for us to stay here another year. Jill rehearsed some of the rumors, the absurd accusations, the lies about my father, and then remarked, my surprise is that intelligent people, once knowing the caliber of the attack and the attackers even listen, why does what they say have much power to damn? Why does the administration take so much notice? It seems that wrong is going to triumph. Des was hurt by Parmenter's criticism and replied, to come to your conclusions before hearing the accused is surprising. Did you ask men who had heard me take a series of meetings, or men who had responded on the basis of gossip? Are you prepared to take a step of some magnitude on the ground of unfair accusation which has never been thoroughly sifted? You blame me because of the fruitage of witnessing for Christ is not evident in the North American division, as though the ripple of the presence of one speaker, myself, for a year could be intended to reverse the legalistic thrust of a century. I cannot believe you are serious. Please note, Ellen G. White says the reason for the paucity of converts is that justification is not preached enough. As you think on the evangelistic results in Australia, could this statement have some relevance? So Seventh-day Adventist Church has historically doubled in size every 20 years because it has been very effective in gaining converts. Okay, I think this is good for now. Let's wrap up.